All right, guess we can go ahead and get started. I'm Kevin. If you've seen my panels before, you know I tend to do rundowns of topics that I think are a little bit under-discussed sometimes, and this is one that, you know, if you look at the media that gets exported from Japan to the West a lot, it's usually either science fiction, usually including giant monsters of some sort, or the period piece, you know, samurai movies. Those are the big things that Japan is sort of known for on the international cinema circuit. And then the question comes up of like, well, why hasn't there been a samurai giant monster movie? And at that point I go, aha! I have a lecture for you. So this is going to be mostly just a rundown of a lot of examples, but I'm going to have a smidge of a history lesson in here as well. So it'll be a little bit educational, so everyone can feel very, you know, validated and like they have improved themselves this weekend. If anyone is here exclusively for the history lesson, like, I don't know, Japanese history majors or something, you might, you know, want to throw things at me after this is done. We'll take a run through and talk about some examples as they come up. So, sort of part of the impetus for this is the way that fandom sometimes will talk about Japanese history that makes me pull my hair out. So one thing that I keep hearing is like, oh, we're currently in Japan's Neo-Heisei period or Millennium period, and I'm like, no, those are marketing things. That is not actual history, because, you know, in the Godzilla series, as we all know, Godzilla was rebooted in 1999, so they changed the branding, so it wasn't called the Heisei series movies, but we're still in the Heisei era right now, and we will be until. Does anyone know what the Heisei era means? Yeah, the current emperor is the Heisei emperor, and he's looking to abdicate soon, so soon we'll have a new era, but until he does, we're not going to. Before the Heisei era, we had the Showa era. And that's another thing that sometimes the way people talk about it is like, oh, we had World War II and then we had the Showa era. Like, no, that's not the way it works. World War II was during the Showa era. The way that the emperor's power dynamic changed a whole lot due to World War II, but the Showa era began, you know, running since the 1920s. So, and then everything before that sort of gets lumped into pre-war or samurai times, and that's where things get a little bit ambiguous, because pre-war is a long time. so here are some Western movie examples, and you wouldn't just like look at all these characters and be like, yeah, I don't see why they couldn't all run into each other, right?
Yeah. So
for anyone wanting a crash course, there's an awesome video online called The History of Japan. It has some profanity, so don't watch it around little kids, but it's humorous, but it gives a very succinct, like 7-minute or so, just crash course on the entire history of Japan. So that's one way that you could go through it, but we don't got time for that here. Now, another thing when you're talking about history is with historical dramas, you have history and mythology, and sometimes those lines get blurred. So again, here are some Western examples. So Dracula was a real dude, and Billy the Kid was a real dude, and Billy the Kid versus Dracula, it was not real.
So 400 years.
You never know.
So, you know, it's definitely a case where it can be misleading sometimes, where you're looking at these like historical drama movies and be like, well, that's a real figure that shows up in this, but you gotta sometimes learn where to draw the line, and that gets difficult sometimes when you're looking at documents that are 1,300 years old. So we can make some inferences, and this is going to be a little interesting because some of these are going to be based in history and archaeology, and some of these are going to be way more mythology.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start at the beginning, the Paleolithic. And a long time ago, that is a little bit contested by geneticists right now in terms of how people first came to Japan, but they did. You know, the earliest ancestors of the current indigenous Japanese share some common relatives in India and the Himalayas, but they're fairly, the indigenous people are fairly separate genetically from the rest of the world. So the civilization that dominated Japan for most of its history, we don't know what they call themselves. We call them the Jomon civilization, which is a name made up by archaeologists. And they left behind all sorts of really interesting artifacts, and that's really what we mostly know about them. Their artifacts have influenced Japanese pop culture, though. It's very popular to look at these ancient things and either take their designs just because they're so weird and out there looking, or ascribe some sort of mystic elements to them because we just don't know what they are. So, here's are a couple of examples of Jomon art, and you can see this figure here and the alien Dada from Ultraman have a very similar look. And then Hayao Miyazaki was really influenced by ancient Japanese stuff for the movie Princess Mononoke. So, like the Kodama spirits. If you look at the... Yep.
Has, Ainu oral tradition helped in any way to understand these Jomon artifacts?
Not really, because the Ainu were... the Jomon stuff was more in the south of Japan, and the Ainu were much further in the north.
Okay.
I mean, they all interacted a little bit, but that's also... there are overlaps there. So if you look at... the movie The Little Norse Prince, that was actually based on Ainu oral tradition. Except then they were like, oh no, we can't do anything with the Ainu, that's controversial, let's move the story to Scandinavia.
Okay. Sorry for interrupting.
No worries. The most famous type of Jomon era artifact that you see all over the place in Japanese pop culture are these dogu statues. So these are little humanoid figures, and at some point in the 1960s, people started looking at them and being like, these look like aliens. Well, this is obviously evidence of people in a spacesuit. They must have come to visit the Earth in ancient times and ancient aliens, blah, 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 blah. Watch the History Channel, learn all about it. But, the combination of that and just how sort of out there they are, you see dogu represented all over the place in Japanese science fiction. So here are some examples. We have Sentai, Kamen Rider, Digimon, Ultraman, and you'll see a lot of monsters based on them. Another artifact that I think most of us will be familiar with is the Magatama. So these are little curved shaped beads. And that's another thing that you see because they're so... We don't really know what they were for, so you'll see Japanese pop culture have things where oh, someone's soul is sealed inside of it, or I can use this to communicate with my giant rocket turtle, or so on and so forth. So here are a couple of examples. We all know the Gamera trilogy. Another one is Blue Seed, where they can turn into monsters using a Magatama.
Using them to see a giant locks over people when they're lying. That's a Phoenix Wright reference.
So, as we just talked about a little bit, there are other indigenous groups in Japan, aside from the Jomon civilization, that lasted longer than the Jomon civilization did. The Emeshi, they lived until about the 800s and then died out. In the movie Princess Mononoke, the main character comes from a lost tribe of Emeshi that have somehow lived for hundreds of years undetected by all of the rest of Japan. So in the movie they ride on elk. I don't think that the real people would have done that, but yeah, who am I to say, right? The Ainu continue to exist to this day. They're much like the Native Americans in the States. They have an interesting relationship with the sort of dominant ethnic group here. So there have been controversies revolving the Ainu and their depictions in the media. So Ishiro Honda's movie, The Snowman, or Half Human as it was localized here, caused a bit of a stir, and that's why it's in a self-imposed ban right now, is because they thought, well, when we released this movie, we thought it was okay to depict people in this way, but we don't think it's appropriate anymore, and thus the movie has been kept under wraps. And that's definitely a debate that one can have about whether or not that's the appropriate way to go about it. But yeah, so if you're wondering sort of what the deal is with the Ainu, like they are the indigenous people that currently survive in Japan and are different than most of the Japanese, although there has been a lot of interbreeding to this point where you're not necessarily sure. Sometimes you'll run into people who are like, oh, I'm a quarter Ainu, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But eventually, people came over from Korea. So this leads to the Yayoi period, or what we think of as the birth of Japan, really, in terms of Japan as we currently understand it. This is a Japanese history book for children, and it's a very popular series. And I just love this because there's a little kid riding on a mammoth.
One-handed too.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any precedence for that image to be on the cover, but I think that's sort of amazing. So, in terms of some fiction that's set around the Yayoi period, we have Koni Ichikawa's movie from 1978, The Phoenix, or Phoenix, I guess. Hinotori is the Japanese title. And this is all a backdrop of some people who are indigenous to Japan encountering people coming over from Korea for the first time, and it's really interesting to watch because you'll see them like reacting to like, oh, here's a horse, and us and being modern people, we're like, okay, that's a horse, but for them it's like mind blowing. What is this thing? It's so strange. The main plot of the movie is all about people trying to track down this mythical bird of fire that if you drink its blood you get immortality. It's based on a manga by Osamu Tezuka, the creator of Astro Boy. So this is a cool movie to watch because all of the monsters, the Phoenix and there's a pack of wolves, they're all done in animation, but the people are live action. So you see here's a human actor dude cutting off the head of a animated dog monster thing. So that's what that movie is all about if you get a chance to see it. Another big piece of traditional stuff from the Yayoi period is the Yamato no Orochi, which is part of the Japanese creation mythology. Is this 8-headed dragon that the Susanoo's like the Japanese equivalent of Thor, basically, goes up against and slays this dragon. And that's something that you see come up again and again and again in Japanese pop culture because it's pretty deeply ingrained going back thousands of years. So a couple of examples. We have the Three Treasures from Toho from the 1959. This is a long movie, so be prepared for waiting a long time to get to this sequence where you have the Eijitsuburai did the effects for this Hydra, basically the Orochi. If you want a movie from around the same period that's a little less long, I would recommend Little Prince and the Eight-Headed Dragon. So this is an animated movie. It still has a soundtrack by Akira Ufukube, though. So both of these movies have the same composer, and we all know he likes to recycle stuff, right? So, but yeah, this is sort of an amazing movie. It's right before Toei, like, they lost a lot of money on this, so they cheaped out right after making it. But it's one of those ones that if you watch today, you'll be like, wow, I couldn't tell that this was made in the 60s. This looks like something that could be made today. And also the art style has influenced things like Samurai Jack. Another Orochi flick that a lot of us are going to be familiar with is Yamato Takeru, or Orochi the Eight-Headed Dragon. This tells the Japanese creation mythology, except there's Susanoo is done as a giant robot sort of thing in this version. So it's a little bit less. It is surprisingly faithful, through a filter. If you look at it and think okay, well, this is sort of like this thing, then you can see where they're getting the individual pieces from. So this was this was the big movie for 1994 from Toho. So Godzilla versus Space Godzilla, like that was like the B picture. So a lot of people are like, why is Godzilla versus Space Godzilla so cheap? And like, because they were thinking that this was going to be like the new hit franchise, and they did do a TV anime spin-off from this, but they did not actually manage to make any more movies afterwards. But the Orochi shows up in other places in Tokusatsu as well. There's a monster in Ultraman Gaia that's very much inspired by it, and then so inspired by it that so much that they took that suit and recycled it for an actual Orochi costume in a later Ultraman production. The Onmyouji movies that are about like Taoist magic, and we'll get to those later, also have an Orochi that's sort of like energy looking. And arguably the first movie that Gainax did, this is the first thing that Shinji Higuchi ever did special effects for when he wasn't just an intern on Return of Godzilla, like he was director for the special effects, was this movie Yamato no Orochi no Gyakushu, or Orochi Strikes Again, which is, you can tell that it's an independent movie, but it's also, you can tell that it's an independent movie that will soon not be an independent movie. Like it's very high quality. Like they went from their 8mm to 16mm film stock, and the special effects are just fantastic. And that's basically, the Orochi is an ancient robot. So somebody gets sucked into this Orochi robot, and then it is pulled up to the surface to run amok. And we get anime. I watch a lot of anime, so we're going to see that all over the place. So here are a couple of big examples, One Piece, Ranma 1/2, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Shaman King, Naruto. And then there's another franchise that we might have heard of. It's called Godzilla. And yeah, the Orochi comes up in Godzilla every once in a while as well. So in Giant Monsters All Out Attack, they're saying that the King Ghidorah is an immature version of the Orochi here, which is why he only has 3 heads instead of the full 8. There's a Godzilla manga from the 90s where there's this weird, very creepy mutant Orochi thing, and then we also have from Godzilla Rage Across Time, the comic that Matt Frank did, we have one that apparently Toho was not cool with him using any version from their movies, so he had to make yet another version of the Orochi to work into that one. But Godzilla doesn't just fight the Orochi, sometimes he is the Orochi.
Yeah.
So if you watch Shin Godzilla, the plan that they use to take him down is the Yashiori strategy, and that is from the sleeping potion that they give to the Orochi in the original myth. And if you look at the special construction team's uniforms in the movie, they have these patches with the Orochi and the sword up against it. Also in the concept art, there's one of the patches they were planning on using was actually from the Little Prince and the Eight-Headed Dragon, the horse from that. So we've been on the Yayoi period for a while. Let's move forward in time. So in the Kofun period, we see they're starting to get artifacts that are a little bit more advanced. They're big into these terracotta figures. So I think that the one, I threw in the ones on the side because Cactuar from Final Fantasy, everybody loves Cactuar. But the one that most of us are going to react to is these terracotta warriors that really look a lot like Daimajin, the giant stone golem from the Dai film series. The Daimajin movies do not take place in the Kofun period. The Daimajin movies take place about 1,200 years later. So the idea when you're watching Daimajin is, when you see the statue that looks like this is not supposed to be something recent. This is supposed to be something really ancient. This is like, if you were to, go into a tomb and find Excalibur today. Like, it's a relic, and that's something that doesn't always come across. People are just like, hey, that armor looks weird, because that's not standard samurai armor as we tend to see in movies, because we tend to see samurai movies taking place way, way, way later in time. moving on a little bit, we have the Heian era. So this is when basically the emperor was moved to Kyoto permanently, because before this, the capital was wherever the emperor happened to live. It was sort of a mess. The Heian era, the capital was consolidated, and there was a great deal of prosperity. All of a sudden, things were. There was a lot of scholarship, a lot of. So you see a lot of things dealing with like Taoism and philosophy coming out of this period. So here we have Minamoto no Yorimitsu. I found this this old scroll that has him fighting a monster. Yorimitsu, also known as Raiko, was a samurai. He's a real dude, but apparently he fought monsters. That's one of those myth versus reality sort of things that we come up with. He is one of his main myths is regarding this great big oni. Oni are demons, basically, that lived on the Oe Mountain. So this demon was Shutendoji, and you'll see that name come up over and over in Japanese, like role-playing games and things like that. This movie from Daiei in 1960, The Demon of Mount Oe, it's interesting because they purported to like, no, this isn't like the myth that you know. This is the way that it really happened. The Shutendoji, he wasn't a demon. He was just a misguided individual. But he still had monsters working for him. So in this, we have this big. He has like 3 sorcerers that work for him, and each one of them can transform. And so one of them turns into this big bull thing. So I see a lot of people, Iwakura actually put out a figurine of that bull that came with one of the Magatama from Gamera. So people are like, what is this Gamera monster? It's not a Gamera monster. It's just packaged weirdly. There's also a giant spider in the movie, which is it's a nice effect, even if it's done completely in the dark. But it helps a little bit to just sort of read up as you're watching the movie, or maybe before watching the movie or something like that, because people will come in and go in the movie all the time. You'll be like, who is Kintoki? Who is this Abe no Seime guy? And either read up on their Wikipedia page or something, or just watch more movies, because, yep.
Are the monsters in the film entirely original, or are they actually based on some of the Oni forms?
They are, in fact, based on some of the Oni from mythology. So yeah, like a dude that shows up in this movie, just briefly to be like, yep, this is a demon arm, and then he leaves, and you're like, what was that all about? Is this dude Abe no Seime, who's sort of like the Japanese equivalent of Merlin. He's this wizard, and he shows up in sort of a very youthful, pretty form in the Onmyouji movie series, which has the Orochi show up briefly in it, as well as some mermaids and other monsters here and there. They're really fun just to watch. You know, it's Japanese wizardry, so you know you'll write something on a scroll and throw it, and then it does something. So, and the Heian era is usually not very well represented in a lot of stuff along those lines. So it's fun to see something set in this time period as well. But if you watch this and you're like, oh, I don't know, Abe no Seime, I like that he's younger and prettier, but I wish he were still younger and prettier still. You can watch Garo, where he's now a hot lady. So this is a superhero series anime that's set in Kyoto, and so Raiko is the main character, and Seimei is his partner in superheroing, and this is part of a long-running Japanese superhero franchise that goes into different time periods. But this one is the characters in it are all based on real people, but you know, the real one probably didn't like draw a line in the sky and then turn into a giant golden wolf armor. So one of the figures that shows up in Garo in that particular season is Princess Kaguya. So Kaguya is another Japanese mythological figure from the story of the bamboo cutter. So basically the story of the bamboo cutter is that there's this bamboo cutter, obviously, he's out in the woods, he cuts open a bamboo branch and there's a little girl inside, and then he finds out, oh, this girl is sent from heaven, so I'll raise her as my own, and they have great success. And then all of these suitors come to try to win her over, and then she's like, I must go now, my planet needs me, and then she goes back to the moon. So this is a story that you'll see all the time in Japanese pop culture as well. So a great example is the Toho movie from 1987, Princess from the Moon, also directed by Koni Chikawa. This one is going to be of interest to Toho fans for a few reasons. One of the guests at this convention is in fact in it, Megumi Adaka, but also we have a dragon that shows up in. Because Kaguya doesn't want to marry these guys, she keeps sending them on suicide missions, basically. She's like, I'll marry you if you get the jewel from the head of an Indian sea serpent, and the guy's like, hold my beer. So we get this sea serpent, which was actually a long story. Toho wanted to make a Loch Ness movie about a decade before this. And they never got to, but they kept the design around, so eventually they got to implement it in this movie. So that's why there's a random kaiju sequence in the middle of this movie that's about ancient aliens. Kaguya shows up in Ultraman in a couple of ways. There is a literal Princess Kaguya that shows up in Ultraman Leo, but in Ultraman Ace, originally Ace is two different people, so you have Seiji and Yuko, and they join together, and then they turn into Ultraman Ace as one person. So it's they put their rings together, and their powers combine, and they become Ultraman Ace. But apparently, people were like, "Ooh, I don't know, a female hero in a kid show, that's no good." So they wrote her out of the show, and again, they're like. She reveals, like, actually, all this time I've been from the moon. I need to return to my planet now, which I just think is really great because it's so convoluted. Because you find out that like the alien that was possessing a human to become a superhero was not actually possessing a human. He was possessing another secret alien.
It's aliens all the way down.
Yes.
Yo, dog, I heard you like aliens. I put aliens in your aliens.
So let's fast forward a little bit in time. Now we get to the Muromachi era. I found these great images of Ultraman monsters in Muromachi outfits. So that's sort of most dominated by the period of warring states, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So we mentioned Princess Mononoke a couple times already because it's sort of a greatest hits of Japanese history. So during the Muromachi period, Japan was expanding, so it's almost like the Manifest Destiny thing that we have going on in the States in the 1800s, that the last unexplored regions of Japan are being civilized, and you have these last patches that are being colonized, and that's the central conflict of Princess Mononoke, is that you have sort of the modern civilization is encroaching on the wilderness where the more ancient civilizations are living, and the indigenous people are inherently more in tune with nature or something. That's another trope that you see coming up in Western media all the time as well. Also in the Muromachi period, there was a lot of trade going on with China, so suddenly you had better technology and better weapons and things like that. So that you can see in Princess Mononoke, they have guns. But Dororo is a great example where this is it was a manga series by Osamu Tezuka, but this has the main character is a samurai, but he's like a cyborg samurai. The premise is that demons came and stole all of his body parts, so now he has to go and hunt down each demon, and every time like he slays a demon, then he gets that body part back. So he has like a cyborg eye, he'll go find the demon that took that eye, slay the demon, and then he gets his real eye back. So it's a weird thing because your guy gets like less cyborgy as the movie goes along, which I don't know. I think it's more interesting at the beginning where he can just like pull swords out of his hands rather than at the end. But of course, the big focus of the Muromachi period is the Warring States. So there's a conflict where, you have your emperor who has some power and your shogun who is sort of the leader of the military, and he has some power, and then all of a sudden there's a free-for-all where everybody has some power and all of these different factions in Japan are fighting against each other. So you have these little fiefdoms that are ruled by local chiefs, and that's a great setting for drama because you get have to have all of these conflicts. So a go-to example is the Daimajin trilogy. In each one of these movies, you have some peaceful village is being attacked by some warring village that's just across the valley or mountain or lake or whatever, and the people in the peaceful village are oppressed, and so they pray to their ancient god, who looks like he's from the Kofun period, as we just discussed, and then the god comes to life and he makes the bad people pay. And they are delightful. I would recommend anyone check out the Daimajin trilogy. It is from Daiei, so you think of like, oh, Daiei, they're the people that made the Gamera movies, but like this is the Gamera versus Baragon period of Daiei, not like the Gamera versus Zigra period of Daiei. Fantastic special effects, and they're also great. Like if you have friends that are only into samurai movies, it's a great bait and switch because they'll be watching this like samurai drama for like the first 70 minutes of the movie, and then a monster shows up, and then they'll be like, I guess I better finish it. So. A similar premise from a similar time period, we have Moon Over Tao. This is another movie that focuses on a warlord who he finds a meteorite that's full of iron that came from space, and he's like, I can make the best swords out of this, and I can conquer all of my neighbors. And of course there's a monster in the middle of the iron that he's unwittingly, or maybe not so unwittingly, releasing on the world. So this is one of my favorite Japanese movies of all time. So it's the monster design is just really unique. So not very practical for a suitmation effect, but it's one of the first ones to do a lot of CG, and that makes it work out. Also set in this time period is the Legend of the Eight Samurai. So this is one that is based on the Hakenden, which is an ancient Japanese novel, and the idea in the Hakenden is that you have these 8 warriors. Each one of them was born with a magic stone that has some representation on it, and then the warriors are all brought together to save the day. And the bringing together stones to do stuff, that's definitely an inspiration for Dragon Ball. And I sort of wonder if the Infinity Gauntlet had some inspiration from that as well, but haven't been able to track down a confirmation one way or another. This movie was directed by Kinji Fukasaku, and you have some great effects from Ekis Productions in there. So you have a giant snake that shows up and a giant centipede, just things for our heroes to fight, and Etsuko Shihomi and Sonny Chiba are in it, so it's good martial arts fun all around. If you want a more classic version of the same story, you can check out Eight Brave Brothers, which is a trilogy of movies from the 1950s, where you have a little bit more, it's a little bit hokier in the effects, but it's still a lot of fun. It's sort of like a serial, so each movie ends on sometimes a literal cliffhanger, like somebody's like about to fall off of the roof, and then it's like, tune in next time. So. But speaking of the Hakenden and Fukasaku, we had Legend of the Eight Samurai. This is sort of a remake of Fukasaku's earlier movie, and it's got the same cast, but the previous time he made it, it was set in outer space. So yeah, the movie Message from Space, it's the same story adapted from the Hakenden, except it's a lot less literal because Star Wars had just come out, so they're like, let's have them all be alien samurai, and that's why the aesthetics of the movie are a little bit strange. So, since we're in the Warring States period, that means we have a lot of assassinations going on, and when you need to assassinate someone in ancient Japan, you're going to need a ninja. Ninjas are definitely one of those figures that have been mythologized quite a lot, and it's interesting just to see all of the weird baggage that's come up with them over the centuries. You know, historically, a ninja is going to be somebody that looks like a janitor. They're not going to be somebody that's running around in black pajamas and like turning into a log when you hit them or something. But over time, we've sort of gotten this very standard sort of set of powers that ninjas can do. They can run up walls and do special jutsu or whatever, where they can summon magical powers. And what better example of this is there than the Red Shadow? This is Akakage, based on a manga by Mitsuteru Yokoyama, the same guy that did Gigantor and Johnny Sacco. So this was just in the height of the kaiju boom. So your main character is a ninja, and he has two sort of ninja sidekicks, and the three of them fight all sorts of giant monsters over the course of the run. Unfortunately, the series has not been properly localized for the States, but they did do a bunch of compilation movies that you can find really, really cheap. One of the monsters that's in this is actually recycled from another movie that we'll get to in a little bit. Eventually, Japan was unified at the end of the Sengoku period by this dude Oda Nobunaga, who is sort of, he was not a good person, but he's sort of been immortalized and mythologized as this, you know, very ambitious warlord throughout history. And my favorite example of this is when he's reincarnated in an anime about a teenage girl who has the soul of Nobunaga, so she can summon a giant gun and go out and fight giant monsters that go and attack. Nobunaga is a fun anime. It's got, well, for one thing, it calls the Gamera trilogy really excellent, so I'm always pro things like that. But Ultraman references to Independence Day, you know, all sorts of alien invasion flicks. So, following the Warring States period, very briefly, we have this Azuchi-Momoyama period. The character in this scroll that's killing, I think it's a fish or a lizard. I'm not really sure what that's supposed to be, but it doesn't look like a real thing. But that is a real guy. That's Miyamoto Musashi, who wrote the Book of Five Rings, and he's also Toho did a trilogy of movies that they call the Samurai Trilogy, and he's the main character of those. And, you know, the main character of Samurai Showdown is based on him. He shows up a lot.
Musashi fighting Kaiju, that's awesome.
Yeah, and that's like, that's not even like modern revisionism. That's like ancient Musashi fighting Kaiju.
That's so cool.
So during this period, we had a lot of trading with like the Dutch, for an example, coming into Japan and bringing new philosophies, new technologies, all that sort of stuff into it. The movie Sakuya Yokaiden is set around this time period, as is a sequel novel, which is expressly about the Dutch trading. So Sakuya is a yokai movie, so it's all traditional Japanese spirits, and this is something that we'll see after Japan is unified. All of a sudden, everyone's mythology sort of begins to lump together because people are able to talk to each other. So, you know, you have the people from over here, like, hey, you hear this story about the long-necked woman, and the people from over here, hey, do you hear this story about this water imp that likes cucumbers? And then they get together and like, yeah, I don't see any reason why these monsters can't just hang out together. So you start getting these like monster mashes of yokai, basically, and you begin to get sort of a very codified, you know, all of them coming together into a single cohesive mythology. So Sakuya's about that. Shinji Higuchi did the special effects for a sequence with a giant spider woman at the end. Kiyotaka Toguchi also worked on that sequence, so it's really fantastic. So,
this is the one called Sakura Demon Slayer?
Yeah, Sakuya Slayer of Demons is another title for it. It's unfortunate because this one is only available in the U.S. dubbed into Chinese with English subtitles for some reason, but if you are crafty on the internet, you might be able to find a Japanese copy with English subtitles that might or might not be legit. I won't say any more specifics than that, but. Another great example that I've just got to bring up because I think this is fantastic is this novel, Daimajin Adventure, which is set in the backdrop of there is this Christian ruler called Amakusa Shiro Tokisada, and his brand of Christianity was not exactly endorsed by anyone else. So he was like, I think I'm the Messiah, or maybe the anti-Messiah, or maybe both. He basically was persecuted by the government because Christianity was outlawed at the time, and he's gone on to become sort of weird figure that you see show up in a lot of Japanese works like Makai Tensho, Samurai Rebirth, or it had a lot of English titles, which Samurai Reincarnation is another one that you see a lot. Anyway, so you've got him, you've got Gyakyu Jubei and Minamoto Musashi. They're all these samurai figures that are coming into conflict at this time period. You also have Daimajin, as we talked before. He's like this ancient stone god that is a protector of Japan. But this novel brings in a third element that's really cool. This novel is part of a series called the Cthulhu Mythos Files. So the position posited by this is like, oh, these Christian missionaries that were coming over to Japan, they weren't really Christian missionaries. They were actually worshiping H.P. Lovecraft's ancient demon gods, ancient ones. So you have your Japanese god, Daimajin, has to come into conflict with these Lovecraftian monsters.
Right.
So the first chapter of this is officially available in English, but unfortunately none of the rest of the novel's been translated, so it's a little frustrating. Another work from this time period is Demon Hunter Mitsurugi. This is another ninja series. In this case, we have the monsters are all represented in stop motion, so that's something that's a little unusual for a Japanese TV series, and I thought it was worth mentioning. But we can speed things up a little bit, I guess. Now we get to the Edo period. I thought, what better to represent the Edo period than the movie King Kong Appears in Edo, which is unfortunately lost for all time, most likely. It's a King Kong movie from 1938, I think. All right. Terrestrial Defense Force Iko-chan. This was a series of movies by Minoru Kawasaki. The sort of on the cheap direct-to-video movies. There is a movie, the third one, Iko and company. They all travel back in time to the Edo period, and they meet this samurai robot dude. The samurai robot dude is played by the actor who played Kikaider in the Japanese superhero series Kikaider, and then he transforms into a giant robot at the end it's got the half red, half blue Kikaider motif going on there, which is I was pretty delighted when I saw that. A great piece of literature that comes out of the not necessarily great literature, but entertaining literature that comes out in the Edo period is the Tale of Jiraiya. So this is about a samurai named Jiraiya. He has a nemesis named Orochimaru, and Jiraiya can summon a giant frog, and Orochimaru can summon a giant snake because, Orochi. And this is a dude that shows up all over the place in Japanese pop culture. So a couple of examples here. This is a really, really old Japanese movie called The Hero Jiraiya from the 1920s, and you can see already then we have suits for the frog and the snake. So when people tell you like, oh, Godzilla's the first Japanese monster movie, don't believe them. We have a couple of other examples. We have the frog summoning in the video game Nioh. We have a ninja frog in Pokemon. We have one in Naruto, a character named Jiraiya, and also in Kaku Ranger, where the frog is one robot that combines with other robots to form a bigger robot, and then they can fight a monster every week. My absolute favorite Jiraiya story is the Magic Serpent, though. This movie is awesome. I would recommend anyone check it out. It's full of like ninja craziness, and I mean the big draw is of course that you have the Jiraiya turning into the toad and Orochimaru turning into the dragon at the end. But there's all these just really bonkers moments that lead up to that, just being the most ridiculous ninja things possible. So, you know, a character will get their head cut off and then the head will fly around and then, aha, it's all the diversion. And like, how does that work? I guess it's ninja magic. The other thing is, if you are a fan of Star Wars, you need to watch this movie because a lot of things are suspiciously similar to the point where people are like, huh, okay, so this dude is actually one of the protagonist's father, okay, and this guy was trained by this weird desert hermit that trained the guy that was actually the dude's father. So, okay. So it is an absolute blast, and unfortunately, this is another one where you can find a dub of this, and it's a pan and scan dub. If you can track down the Japanese version, I would suggest it. But it is absolutely a blast. This is peak kaiju boom material. All right, so we talked a little bit about how during the Edo period, all sorts of yokai mythology was coming together, and we see this especially in the yokai trilogy of movies from Daiei. So right after Daimajin, they do this trilogy. My favorite of the trilogy is, of course, the one with a giant monster in it. So this is Spook Warfare. And Spook Warfare is about this ancient Babylonian vampire that comes and he fights all of the local Japanese monsters. So the kappa and the long-necked woman and the umbrella spirit and all of these weird-looking... If you haven't looked into Japanese mythology, there's some strange monsters that are involved there. So the demon in this is actually based on a real Babylonian creature, real mythology. It's called Lilith. So you can see the relief of Lilith there, and then what the design in the movie came out to be, which is a little bit different. Speaking of ancient statues, at this time period in the 1600s, we start seeing these lion dog statues imported from China, and they show up in Okinawa first. So that's why in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, they go to Okinawa with this lion dog statue, which winds up turning into a real god. Zapong is another movie that takes place in this time period. It's got some interesting rubber monsters, but we can gloss over that one. This is a movie that came out just this year on TV in Japan, Kojin. This is about a little sleepy town in the north of Japan that's terrorized by this big dinosaur creature, and it's based on a novel by Miyuki Miyabe. But what I think is really interesting is this is like Shin Godzilla exploitation. Because if you look at the original novel, the creature is like bipedal and it has like a long tongue and doesn't have eyes all over it. And then when you watch the movie version, it's like this little low to the ground brown alligator thing that looks a whole lot like the first form of Shin Godzilla. So, and that's the thing that like the people that worked on the movie even like fully admit in interviews. They'll say stuff like, "Oh yeah, Shin Godzilla gave us a tailwind," or whatever that means. For no other reason than that Kojin sounds like Gojin, I'll mention Gojin, which is a sort of like Ultraman set in the Edo era. This is a manga series that ran for a few years back in the 90s. You can track it down pretty easily. While talking about manga, there was also a Godzilla manga from 2014. There's a short story where Godzilla shows up in the Tokugawa period, and there's also an invasion from Planet X. So it's, if you want to see Godzilla fighting samurai in a manga, this is the one to track down. And then one more yokai related example, Ghost Slayer Sayashi. This series has this is an anime, 26 episodes I think. it has some giant monster fights, but also the soundtrack is by Ko Otani, who did the soundtrack to the Gamera trilogy. So it's got that really bombastic sound to it, which is just so perfect for giant monster fights. Moving on to the Meiji Era, the one kaiju movie I can name from the Meiji Era is The Whale God. It's sort of Moby Dick inspired. It's sort of very, very, very Godzilla inspired. As in the original Godzilla. So this is about a fishing village that's terrorized by this giant whale, and a rivalry between these two guys. Yes, one of them is the same actor that played Zatoichi, and they want to hunt down and destroy this whale. And there's a lot of imagery in it that you're like, oh, this is a lot like the original Godzilla. You know, and it'll have the monster's coming, sound the alarm, and they'll hit the bell, or you'll have the survivors washing up on the beach. And the actor that played Dr. Yamane is also in the movie. As he's sort of playing the anti-Dr. Yamane, is like, whoever kills this monster gets to marry my daughter. So, but yeah, so after the Meiji period, we get to the Showa era, and all of a sudden, it's one of those things where, like, okay, well, now all of a sudden we are actually able to make movies that take place in this time period. So we don't get a whole lot of period pieces going backwards into the Showa era. You know, the big example I can think of is Reigo, the Shinpei Hayashiya movie that is about the giant monster fighting the battleship Yamato during World War II, which is a fantastic premise for a movie, by the way. Yeah, on that note, we are caught up with modern times. So we've gone through 2,000 years of history. All right, who feels educated?
That's cool.
Yep.
So far there hasn't been any work set in Japan, in Japan sort of overseas adventures like you have the Imjin War in the 16th century, at the end of the 16th century, and then of course you've got during the Showa era and the Meiji era, you have the Russo-Japanese War and the first invasion of China. There's nothing about those.
Not very often in like the monster movie context. I can think of some movies that are set against like the Russian war, but not like science fiction-y. And you know, it could be a thing where like, especially during the Showa era, maybe they're like, ooh, this is too close for comfort or something. But there are a couple of other, like, not giant monsters, but like Lorelei, Witch of the Pacific, is also set against the Pacific War and things like that.
Interesting.
Are you going to sell any of your books?
Yes, that is a good point. I have books. If people want to buy books, I wrote a book of 101 alternative. Here's one. Alternative giant monster movies. So if you want some kaiju stuff that is not Godzilla or Gamera, I have a review collection. If you've read my stuff on the Mazer Patrol blog, it's a similar sort of layout and format. So. And I'll be around all weekend, so if you've got somewhere to be, then feel free to catch me at any time. Yep.
I was wondering, what did you think of the TV miniseries Daimajin Karen?
It's frustrating. It's one where, because it's a TV series, you go through the whole series basically before Daimajin shows up, and then Daimajin is more. Like, they don't call him Daimajin, they call him Bujin, and in fairness, they don't always call him Daimajin in the movies either, but canon is one where I like parts of it, but if you're watching it for giant monster stuff, it's frustrating, and then if you're watching it for Daimajin, like, the creature that shows up and then, like, wants songs sung to him and talks and things like that, and has chronic depression, it's sort of like, well, this doesn't seem like the wrathful Oni that we got in the movie series. So, but you know, it's neat that they had the yokai stuff. I think that the action could have been a little bit better, especially because when that came out, that was the most expensive TV series that had ever been done in Japan. So, when you look at other, like when Ultra Q came out, that was the most expensive TV series that ever came out in Japan, and you could be impressed by it, or like Mikazuki. And Daimajin Kanon was more like, this is a fine little drama, but it's not one of the like top tier recommendations, basically. Yep.
So not only was, I think I remember hearing from like an interview with Ishiro Honda that King Ghidorah himself was actually meant to be like a modern version of Orochi. And
Yeah.
so not only is from what I can recall, not only is GMK meant to be like a baby Orochi, but the character himself was meant to be like an Orochi from space because that's what was popular in the 60s.
Yeah, I mean they don't explicitly say that in the movie, but I mean the design is very, very similar. So, and again, Toho had made an Orochi movie, so it's like they had that down pat basically. All right, people filing in. All right, well. I will be around, so anyone who wants to talk to me about anything ever, just come up and talk to me. I'm not shy.